let's start with the issue of slavery. And it's certainly the case that the people that you're describing and the intellectual and Marxist influenced types who criticize the more traditional institutions of the West accept it as a given that slavery is wrong. And so you could imagine there might be two reasons for that. One reason would be one group should not have the upper hand over another, or at least if you're the group that's in the oppressed class, you might not want that to be the case. And the other argument is there's something intrinsically wrong with slavery as such, but at the individual level. And so I guess one of the things that struck me is that unless you believe the second, you're just trying to swap one form of slavery for another, and it isn't also clear why it's wrong. And slavery is wrong if you believe that the individual should be sovereign, able to make choices, able to make free and unconstrained choices that aren't subject to the arbitrary will of another. But to believe that, you have to believe that there is such a thing as the individual. That's the right unit of analysis. And that the idea that that individual is valuable and sovereign in some fundamental sense is true. And then when I think that, I think there isn't anywhere in the world where that idea has been expressed more clearly than in the West. And so it's so interesting to see people object to slavery and object to the use of arbitrary power by one group over another, but also to reject wholesale the individualism, the notion of individual value that's at the heart of the Western enterprise, that seems to be the basis for the rejection of slavery per se. You do point out, for example, that it wasn't obvious that Karl Marx objected to slavery on moral grounds. So it seems too obvious to even be asked, why is slavery wrong? But when everything obvious is up for grabs, then it's perfectly reasonable to ask that. And so part of the problem with setting the group against the individual is that you see that the people who do that seem to invalidate their own moral claim that what they're opposing is wrong. Like, on what basis is it wrong? And does that seem like a reasonable position to you?
Yes, and I mean, well, one of the most fascinating things about this, I go into in the section on slavery in the book, is that, of course, historically speaking, it would have been highly unusual to be opposed to slavery in almost any era. And there were lots of reasons for that. I mean, you first of all have one of the questions, as you know, that I delve into at one point in the book is, why are the Enlightenment philosophers under particular attack at the moment? And there are various explanations you could give for that. One is that there is a genuine overdue reckoning, that there is a form of Enlightenment, let's say fundamentalism at the moment, that views figures of the Enlightenment as particularly needing this sort of scouring and reapproach. Another is that they happened to have the misfortune to live in an era in which both the slave trade and colonialism, currently seen as the two great wrongs of history of the West, were going on, and that they didn't spend enough of their time countering them, and that Immanuel Kant should have spent more time addressing slavery and less time addressing all of the questions that he addressed, and that rather than talking about superstition and trying to pull that apart, David Hume should have been interested in colonialism, and on and on. So that's another explanation. And a third explanation, which I think is perhaps more persuasive, is that actually, if you go for the Enlightenment philosophers, you get to one of the absolutely key things to assault if you're going to assault the West, which are the ideas of rationalism and reason and the application of the scientific method and much more. But the reason I mention this is because, of course, what's so fascinating is that there are two aspects of the slavery thing in particular that need to be delved into. One is that thing of, well, everybody did it throughout history. And there's a counter which Kendi, among others, do, which is, well, Western slavery was worse because it was race-based. And by the way, that's absolute nonsense. I mean, countless societies had effectively race-based slavery, and indeed it's going on today in the Middle East and in Africa. But there was a specific reason, actually, why during the Enlightenment period, and I cite Thomas Jefferson on this, because he's a very interesting figure, trying to think this through as they were going through it. One of the reasons why Thomas Jefferson is so interesting is because he is one of the most thoughtful people of his era, was still not aware of whether or not there was an answer or which way the answer went to what was still a live conversation then, which was the monogenesis and polygenesis argument. That was the argument over whether or not all the human races were from the same stock, as it were, or whether we were all from different lines. That debate seems obvious to us now because it got answered later in the 19th century. It wasn't obvious at that time, and people like Jefferson were trying to do what they could with it. So there was one version of the defense of slavery, which was, well, these are all totally different people. But then, of course, you have to counter that with the fact that, and again, Voltaire made this point, what is the greater evil? To sell somebody and buy somebody of a different country, a different race, and so on, or to sell your neighbor or your brother or the member of your community. Now, of course, this is just as it was when Voltaire asked the question. It's an exceedingly uncomfortable question to ask today, and I don't ask it in order to say, well, there's an obvious answer. But as everybody knows, the slave trade only existed because people in Africa were selling their brothers and their neighbors and raiding neighboring towns of people who looked exactly like them and selling them to other black people in Africa, some of whom ended up in the slave trade going across the Atlantic, many more of whom went through the slave trade that went to Arabia. So it took an awfully long time for our species to even begin, and we're not there yet by any means. I've met people in my own life who are slaves, were born slaves, in Africa and elsewhere. This is by no means solved by our species, but we look back at it now as if it was perfectly obvious.
Well, look.
You know, folks, it seems every single time, as Douglas points out, the political play deck card, they throw the S card out, slavery, the C card out, colonialism. Those seem to be two of the biggest sins that the West has committed. Slavery and colonialism. Anytime a leftist, a socialist, a liberal is in trouble, you know, they throw that out, just like they throw out the racist card, the R card, the B card, the bigot card. They throw them out. The phobic cards, right? Transphobic, this phobic, that phobic. And my question is, how long do we in the West, how long do Western democracies, how long do people on the right, how long do conservatives have to answer the question and say, we're sorry for that sin that was committed back centuries ago? The fact is, it's continuing to this day. There is slavery on a much greater scale going on today. But the reason why they don't talk about it, because it's not white oppressorship against, you know, black or brown or marginalized people slavery. Oh no. This slavery that's happening today currently, it's happening in those countries. It's happening with blacks. It's happening in Asian countries. It's happening in the Middle East. It's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. But that doesn't make the great narrative of the white oppressor. Right? The white oppressor that came to the shores of a country and stole its people and enslaved them to do work in the cotton fields, work on the farms, work to build up the countries. That doesn't play right. So that's why nobody talks about it. But it's easy to go back in the past a few centuries and talk about the evils and the sins of what America committed with its slave industry. But as we point out, Voltaire asked that question, what's worse? They're both terrible. The questions Voltaire asked, what's worse? The person who comes and buys a slave from someone else and has no relationship to that slave other than he's purchasing and buying? Or the people that actually started the enslavement of their own people, their own brothers and sisters, their own countrymen, enslaved them and sold them to others to go to other parts of the world? I would say it's the latter. The people that started the slave trade, that enslaved their own people. That's I would say, is a greater sin, a greater assault on the sovereignty of a human being. Because without that, you don't have the ladder. There is nobody to sell into slavery if you don't start by gathering slaves from your own people, people that you've owned conquered in your own country, your own lands, and then sell them to go abroad. But the left will continue to utilize this in arguments when they're losing a battle and will throw those political card decks on the floor because for most people, it stops them in their tracks. But we have to learn to fight back and to push back and to talk back against that kind of narrative and take the narrative back to the original thing to say that slavery was bad, but it is no longer in Western democracies. Anyways, we appreciate you taking the time to watch. You've been watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show. I've been your host. My name is Dr. Nasir. If you haven't done so already, we'd love for you to subscribe to the channel, like, share, and follow. You all know what to do. Take a look at our video links above and below. Leave you with my final thought, which is, when you're right, you're right, and when you're left, you're wrong. Until next time, folks, take care and stay safe.